your heart. It beats your whole life without missing a single step. But if it does, there are medical solutions to help save your life.
Hi everyone. This lesson is on the circulatory system, specifically the heart, blood vessels, and structures of the circulatory system. So the circulatory system can be very different in single-celled organisms versus multicellular organisms. So in a single-cell organism, nutrients and gases enter through simple diffusion. But once you have a larger organism, we need a more complex circulatory system because simple diffusion isn't enough because the organism's too large. So to be effective, a circulatory system needs to be connected to all the body tissues. So our circulatory system is composed of a central pump, so like a heart, that could pump over 2.5 billion times through 96,000 kilometers of blood vessels in a lifetime. In 1 minute, on average, your heart will beat around 70 to 80 times and send blood through a complete circuit, about 15 kilometers, 3 times every minute. So our circulatory system has 4 main functions. One is the transportation of gases, so from breathing and cellular respiration, move nutrient molecules from digestion, and move wastes. It's also responsible for the regulation of body temperature and the water balance, the transportation of chemical messengers called hormones, and the protection of the body by transporting white blood cells and platelets to areas of injury and infection. There are 3 main components to our circulatory system. One is the blood vessels, which serve as the roadways through which the blood flows. The heart, which is an organ that pushes blood through the body with its pumping action. And the blood, which serves as the medium to transport materials and cells around the body. So first, we're going to talk about the blood vessels. So there are 3 types of blood vessels. One is arteries. So arteries carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart. So remember, arteries away from the heart. There's 3 layers to an artery, and the walls are quite thick and elastic to allow them to flex when the heart pumps and then snap back during the relaxation, which helps force blood through the arteries in the correct direction. So these arteries can contract and relax to change their diameter, called vasoconstriction or vasodilation, and this is important to help warm the body up, cool the body down, or to allow more blood to flow through times of strenuous exercise. So here's the cross-section of an artery. So we have a thick outer wall, an inner layer that has elastic muscle and tissue fibers, and then an endothelium, so the inner layer of cells lining that artery. And then there's a central area through which blood flows. Veins carry oxygen-poor blood or deoxygenated blood back towards the heart. Veins typically have thinner walls than arteries and are not elastic, so they cannot force blood back to the heart. We rely on contractions of the skeletal muscles to squeeze the veins and force blood along them. And then our veins have one-way valves to make sure that blood does not travel the wrong way. And this is really important in our legs where the blood has to overcome gravity. So if you've ever flown on an airplane, one of the recommendations is to get up and walk around every 30 minutes or so, or if you're taking a long car ride, to stop every 2 hours and walk around. Because if you sit for a long period of time without moving, often the blood can start to kind of just pool in your legs a little bit, and some people, this puts them at higher risk for blood clots because the blood is sitting still for a long period of time. So that walking around action does a great job of forcing blood back up through the veins towards our heart. The last type of blood vessel is a capillary, which are the smallest blood vessels, and about 10 capillaries could fit into the diameter of the average human hair. So capillaries connect arteries and veins to tissues, and this is actually going to be the site of nutrients and waste transfer between the blood, the cells, and the interstitial fluid. Capillary walls are only 1 cell thick and are only as large enough for 1 blood cell to pass through at a time. So that allows for oxygen to effectively diffuse from the blood cells to the muscle tissue and for carbon dioxide to diffuse back into the blood from the muscle tissue. So we can see here a color-coded capillary bed where we have the arteriole in red representing oxygenated blood. And as those blood flows through those capillaries, it becomes more blue as it becomes deoxygenated. And then it moves through a venule or a small vein back towards the heart. So when we're looking here at the path of blood, we want to understand that Human circulatory system is a closed system. So we don't want anything to enter or exit the circulatory system. We want all the blood to stay inside. Blood cells travel the same path and they never leave the system except when they've become broken down, and then they'll be broken down in the liver. So our path of blood goes from the heart to arteries, which travel away from the heart, to smaller arterioles, which then will become capillaries. And in the capillaries, the blood becomes deoxygenated. It will travel then through a venule, which is a small vein, a vein, and then back to the heart, where it will then be pumped to the lungs to become oxygenated again. The second part of the circulatory system is the heart. So the human heart is about the size of 2 fists held together at the knuckles. Okay. I've also heard 1 fist, so it really does depend on the size of your hands compared to the size of your body. It's surrounded by a fluid-filled sac called the pericardium, which then helps protect the heart. And the heart is located slightly to the left of the middle of the chest. The heart is responsible for pumping blood through the body in one direction and must keep the oxygen-poor blood and oxygen-rich blood separate, or else we would have that oxygen exchange in the in the heart, and we wouldn't get oxygen to our body cells. And the walls of the heart are made up of special muscle that only exists in the heart called cardiac muscle cells. And cardiac muscle cells are really spectacular because they're able to contract rhythmically and involuntarily. So if you have heart cells in a dish, as you can see on the bottom little video here, that they just rhythmically contract on their own with no input from any other nerves or cells. So when we look at mammalian hearts like the one that we have, it has 4 chambers. The top 2 chambers are called atria. Singular would be atrium, and the bottom 2 chambers are called ventricles. So the atria act as holding chambers, and they fill with blood returning from the body or the lungs. The ventricles are on the bottom, which receive blood directly from the atria and pump it to the lungs in the body. Because the ventricles pump blood further, they are thick and muscular, and to force blood great distances. The right and left sides of their heart are separated by a thick wall called the septum. And then this keeps the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood separate. The atria and the ventricles are separated by valves called the atrioventricular valves. So it's between the atria and the ventricles to make sure there's no backflow of blood from the ventricles into the atria. So when the ventricles contract, we want that blood to be forced out of the heart to the body versus going back up into the atria. And then these valves are connected to small muscles by tissue known as the chordae tendonae. So here we can look at the structure of the heart. So it's been slightly color-coded. So we have on the left of the picture, we have the right atria and right ventricle, because these are named as if they were in our body, not when we're looking them at a picture. So the right atrium and the right ventricle are on the right-hand side of our body, but they'll be on the left-hand side of a picture. And they're separated by the tricuspid valve, but for us, we just need to know that it's an atrioventricular valve. Leaving the ventricle, the right ventricle, it goes through the pulmonary artery out to the lungs. Then we have pulmonary veins coming back from the lungs into the left atrium. From the left atrium, we will go through another atrioventricular valve into the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle out through the aorta to the body. And then we'll go into this in much more detail later on. So the heart goes through 3 phases. It has a diastole phase when the heart is relaxed as it recovers between contractions. Atrial systole, the systole phase, when the atria contract. So they push, the atrial systole phase is when the atria contract to push blood into the ventricles through the atrioventricular valve. And the ventricular systole, where the atria relax and the ventricles contract to push blood into the arteries. This closes the atrioventricular valve and causes the first heart sound lub. The heart now relaxes again back into diastole, and the semilunar valves close. These are the ones into the aorta to prevent blood flowing back into the ventricles, which causes the second heart sound, dub. So when we think about a heartbeat, it would go lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. And that's when the atrioventricular valves are closing and the semilunar valves are closing to seal off the ventricles. So we talked about how cardiac muscle cells are really unique because they can beat on their own. But to have an entire heartbeat, this is much more complex than the beating of an individual cardiac muscle cell. So to make sure that the heart beats systematically and not individually, it's controlled by an electronic impulse that originates from the heart itself. And so this is known as the sinoatrial node. because the atria contract first. And this stimulates the heart muscles to begin contracting and rhythmically relaxing. So the sinoatrial node is also called the pacemaker. And if you've ever heard of somebody who has a pacemaker, what it does is the pacemaker itself is an implant that will help your heart contract regularly if your heart is having issues. So the sinoatrial node is located on the wall of the right atrium. An electrical impulse from the sinoatrial node causes both atria to contract simultaneously, forcing blood into the bottom of the heart, into the ventricles. And that electrical impulse travels through the septum of the heart to the atrioventricular node at the bottom of the ventricles. So the atrioventricular node transmits this electric impulse through a bundle of fibers known as the bundle of His to the bottom of the heart, where it passes through fast conducting fibers known as the Purkinje fibers, which cause the two ventricles to contract simultaneously. And our ventricles contract from the bottom up to force blood out through the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. So here we have a flow chart. So the sinoatrial node sends an impulse, the atria contract. The atrioventricular node continues to transmit this impulse through the bundle of His to the Purkinje fibers for the ventricles to contract. And when we look at a picture of a heartbeat, we can see this electrical impulse on an electrocardiogram. So in that first impulse, the sinoatrial node contracts, and it causes the atria to contract simultaneously, again forcing the blood down. The atrioventricular node, we can see they're kind of in the center of the heart, receives that impulse and passes it along to the bundle of His, which go down through the septum to the bottom of the ventricle, passing it to the Purkinje fibers, which cause the ventricles to contract much harder. We can see in that echocardiogram to contract the ventricles and force the blood up and out through the aorta and pulmonary artery. So we can see this heartbeat diagram if we do an electrocardiogram, known as an EKG or ECG, which measures the changes in voltage of the heart through the echocardiogram. And it can show us any abnormalities in a heartbeat. So each of these waves has a different letter associated with it. So the P wave, which is that first little hump there, shows the sinoatrial node being excited and the atria contracting. The Q or S waves show the electrical activity just before the ventricles contract and as they contract. So this is where we dip down and then spike up to the very top. And then the T wave shows the ventricles contracting just before another cycle begins. So the T wave is the ventricles relaxing before any other heartbeat. So on the left here, we have a normal heart rhythm, and on the right here, we have an atrioventricular block in an ECG. So this is an abnormal heartbeat where we have repeated P waves, P waves, P waves, which are the wave of the sinoatrial node and the atria contracting. So we have the atria contracting in the echocardiogram on the right several times before the ventricles contract. So this is giving us an abnormal heart rate and a very slow pulse, so bradycardia, so very slow pulse. So we don't see that QRS, that high peak, very often in that ECG on the right. So our heart rate is influenced by autonomic nerves originating from the brain and spinal cord. Again, we don't want to have to think about our heart and if it's working or not. So this is an autonomic activity that our body does. At times of stress, the sympathetic nerves can speed up our heart rate so more blood is pumped to the muscles. This is getting you ready for the fight or flight response if you have an adrenaline rush. If your heart rate can exceed 100 beats per minute, during this, it can be known as tachycardia, so a swift heart rate. And during times of relaxation, our parasympathetic nerves slow our heart rate down. If we have a slow heart rate of less than 60 beats per minute, this can be known as bradycardia. And people have very different heart rates. Some people have resting heart rates 60 or lower beats per minute. Often this will happen if they have a very high cardiovascular output at certain times, like if they're rowers or long distance runners, because their body can alter their heart rate to be really high during times of exercise and also really low during times of relaxation because their heart works very effectively. So lastly, we're going to talk about ventricular fibrillation. So this is when the heart beats So the heart generally beats when electrical signals move through it, and ventricular fibrillation is a condition where the heart's electrical activity becomes disordered. So it's sending random electrical impulses and they're not organized, so our heart's not beating effectively. And so if you've ever watched medical shows, they'll often call it like VTAC. If you've ever taken first aid and AED training, when you put those little stickers onto an individual's chest, that AED machine will recognize if an individual is in ventricular fibrillation or if they have an organized ECG pattern or an organized heart rate. And those AED machines that people have in schools and community halls and libraries and things like that will often only send a shock wave if it recognizes that an individual is in ventricular fibrillation. This is also where CPR comes in effective. If ventricular fibrillation is occurring, you won't detect a typical heart rate, but the heart is still wanting to be active, and occasionally you can restart someone's normal ECG pattern by performing CPR because you're forcing the heart to contract in its normal rhythmic pattern, and eventually the electrical impulse will catch up at the same time. This will often work if somebody has had an electrical shock because possibly it's disordered their heart rate, and then CPR can help bring that back to be standard. Okay, well, thanks for sticking with me for the structures of the heart, and